Today I'm continuing to read from the story of classic crime in 100 books by Martin Edwards. The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie, 1920. The First World War cast a long shadow over the 20s. Its impact on people's lives is evident from the outset of Agatha Christie's first novel, which she began writing in 1916. Captain Arthur Hastings, recently invalidated home from the Western Front, is invited to spend his sick leave with friends at Styles Court. In the green and peaceful Essex countryside, Hastings finds it almost impossible to believe that war is raging not so very far away. I felt I had suddenly strayed into another world. He confesses to his hosts that when the war is over, he has a secret hankering to be a detective. Before long, he bumps into the little man who had fired his imagination years earlier in Belgium and whose name is Hercule Poirot. Poirot, once a famous detective but now a refugee from the conflict, is living nearby. He and some fellow countrymen have benefited from the charitable work of Mrs. Emily Inglethorpe, wealthy chatelaine of Styles, whose recent marriage to a much younger man has proved unpopular with other members of her family. When Mrs. Inglethorpe dies of strychnine poisoning, Hastings seeks Poirot's aid, and they form an updated version of the Holmes-Watson partnership. Hastings describes Poirot as an extraordinary-looking man. He is short, with an egg-shaped head and stiff moustache. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. Hastings says, choosing a topical comparison to emphasize his point, "I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound." Poirot is vain, obsessed with order and method, and a master of the enigmatic remark that misleads Hastings, as well as the reader, as to where his suspicions really lie. Christie blends a rich variety of ingredients, including floor plans, facsimile documents, an inheritance tangle, impersonation, forgery, and courtroom drama. The originality of her approach lay in the way she prioritized the springing of a surprise solution ahead of everything else. Including characterization and description of setting, her prose is economical rather than evocative, but The Mysterious Affair at Styles set the pattern for dozens of Christie's later novels. Poirot made a successful return in The Murder of the Lynx, 1923, much of which is set in France. Although the short stories gathered in Poirot Investigates, 1924, show that Christie's method of hiding clues among red herrings was better suited to a longer story. The third Poirot novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, 1926, notable for a solution so daring that it briefly created controversy, remains one of the most famous of all detective novels, and secured the reputation of both character and author. The little Belgian ranks second only to Holmes in the pantheon of great detectives. Agatha Mary Clarissa Christie, née Miller, worked in a pharmacy during the First World War and put her knowledge of poisons to good use in The Mysterious Affair at Styles and so many other stories. Speculation about the reasons for her brief, highly publicized disappearance in 1926, at a time when her marriage was in crisis, continues, but her fame rests on the enduring worldwide popularity of her books. Nobody has ever written ingenious whodunits with such consistency, and nobody has ever matched her worldwide sales. More than 40 years after her death, she remains a household name. Clouds of Witness by Dorothy L. Sayers, 1926. Lord Peter Wimsey was created as a conscious act of escapism by a young writer who was short of money and experiencing one unsatisfactory love affair after another. Peter Death Breeden Wimsey, second son of the Duke of Denver, began his fictional life as a fantasy figure. He was rich, handsome, charming, and above all, highly intelligent. At Eton, he earned a reputation as an outstanding cricketer, cemented during his years at Balliol College, Oxford, where naturally he took first-class honors in history. During the Great War, he earned the Distinguished Service Order for recklessly good intelligence work behind the German front, before being blown up and buried in a shell hole and suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, as it would now be called, as a result. His convalescence was aided by a love of music and books shared with his creator, and he set himself up in a flat in Piccadilly with a devoted manservant, Mervyn Bunter, who had served as his sergeant during the war. Wimsey's life took a new turn when he indulged in detective work to help solve the business of the Attenbury Emeralds, eventually written up as a continuation novel, The Attenbury Emeralds by Jill Peyton Walsh in 2010. He befriended Charles Parker of Scotland Yard as his uncle said. The only trouble about Peter's new hobby was that it had to be more than a hobby. You cannot get murderers hanged for your own private entertainment. Peter's intellect pulled him one way and his nerves another. At the end of every case, we had the old nightmares and shell shock all over again, and then Denver, Peter's elder brother, Gerald, Duke of Denver, must needs get himself indicted on a murder charge and stand his trial in the House of Lords. Clouds of Witness tells the story of the Denver case, Wimsey's second recorded investigation. He is enjoying an extended holiday in Corsica when he learns that the man engaged to his sister, Mary, Captain Dennis Cathcart, has been found shot dead shortly after quarreling with Denver. At the inquest, a coroner's jury returned a verdict finding Denver guilty of the murder. Wimsey and Parker investigate and soon become convinced that both Denver and Mary have something to hide. While Wimsey makes the transatlantic dash to attend the trial after pursuing his inquiries in the USA, the lawyer Sir Impey Biggs describes him as cleaving the air high above the wide Atlantic. In this wintry weather, he is braving a peril which would appall any heart but his own, that of the world-famous aviator whose help he has enlisted, so that no moment may be lost in freeing his noble and brother from his terrible charge. His lordship is not only a great detective, but also, unlike Poirot, a dashing man of action. At this stage of his career, Sayre's portrayal of him verged on caricature, but as her confidence grew, she sought to characterize him in greater depth. The turning point came in Strong Poison, 1930, when he fell in love with Harriet Vane, who had been charged with murdering her lover. Clouds of Witness is the work of a novelist learning her craft, but manifests the storytelling qualities that soon earned fame for Dorothy Leigh Sayers. An Oxford-educated intellectual, she was also a notable historian and critic of the genre, whose reviews for the Sunday Times display erudition, energy, and enthusiasm in equal measure. Together with Anthony Berkeley, she became a driving force in the Detection Club, using experience gained in the advertising world to help build its reputation. She succeeded E.C. Bentley as president in 1949. Her detective fiction became increasingly ambitious, and although opinion remains divided as to the extent of its success, her contribution to the development of the genre was highly significant before she abandoned crime writing at the end of the 30s to concentrate on religious writing and translating Dante. The Rasp by Philip MacDonald, 1924. Among the great detectives suited to crime solving in the 20s were several men who had experienced a good war. Colonel Anthony Ruthven Guthrie, who first appeared in The Rasp, was a prime example. He is introduced as something of an oddity, a man of action who dreamed while he acted, a dreamer who acted while he dreamed. His parents were a hunting country gentleman who was also a brilliant mathematician, and a Spanish woman who had been a dancer, mannequin, actress, and portrait painter. The vivid, if exaggerated, characterization is symptomatic of a young, energetic author serving his literary apprenticeship. MacDonald was still in his early 20s, as if being courageous, handsome, modest, and likable were not enough, Guthrie was in addition an excellent sportsman and an Oxford graduate skilled in mathematics. He also became known as historian and a man of classics. He was called to the bar, wrote novels and poetry, worked in politics, and then served with distinction in the infantry before being wounded in action. Recruited by the Secret Service, he went undercover in Germany. It was queer work, funny work, work in the dark, work in strange places, showered with decorations by a grateful government and a baker's dozen of other orders, which are foreign. He inherited a fortune and invested in a periodical called The Owl. When the editor of The Owl urges him to look into the sensational murder of John Hood, Guthrie leaps at the chance. Hood is a minister of imperial finance and one of the many politicians who are murder victims in Golden Age mysteries. Perhaps because countless people had motives to kill them, he has been bludgeoned to death with a wooden rasp in the study of his country house, Abbot's Hall. Guthrie falls in love with a young widow, Lucia Lemessurier, who lives across the river from the scene of the crime, but his pursuit of her is complicated by the fact that the man her sister loves is a prime suspect. Guthrie often mentions detective stories, and intersexuality of this kind became commonplace in Golden Age fiction. Scientific know-how culled from Dr. Thorndike's debut, The Red Thumb Mark, 1907, helps him to solve a puzzle about fingerprints. He makes use of his acting ability in unmasking the culprit and wins over Lucia. The zest of MacDonald's prose contributed to the book's success and compensated for flaws such as Guthrie's very lengthy explanation of the mystery at the end. During the 20s, love interest in detective stories was frowned on by purists such as A. Milne and Dorothy L. Sayers, but MacDonald's romantic subplot proved to be ahead of its time. Guthrie's lead was followed by several Golden Age detectives, even Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey, who married a woman they met through solving a murder. Guthrie returned in books which demonstrate MacDonald's gift for building suspense, such as The News in 1930, where he races against time to save an innocent man from the gallows. The surprise solution is a variant of that in The Skeleton Key, page 43. Guthrie's appearances became infrequent after the mid-30s, but he did not take his final bow until 1959. In the list of Adrian Messenger, an extraordinary story of multiple murder that was later filmed by John Huston. Philip MacDonald came from a distinguished literary family. His grandfather, George Fraser MacDonald, was an inspiration to Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, and he co-wrote his first two novels with his father, Ronald MacDonald. MacDonald and J. Jefferson Farjeon co-wrote a screenplay based on The Rasp, which was filmed by the legendary Michael Powell in 1932. MacDonald became a versatile scriptwriter working on projects as varied as Raise the Roof, said to be the first British film musical, and after relocating to the United States, the classic movies Rebecca and Forbidden Planet. Hollywood's gain was crime fiction's loss. Mr. Fortune, Please, by H. C. Bailey, 1927. In The Missing Husband, first of the half-dozen stories in this volume, Reggie Fortune is encountered lazing in a hammock in an orchard where the apple blossom rose out of a flood of bluebells. But H. C. Bailey soon reminds his reader of the darker side of life. Reggie is recovering from the blood poisoning which he acquired in his work as medical expert for the Crown upon the historic crime of the abominable Armenians commences. He is consulted by his friend as the Honorable Sidney Lomas, chief of the CID, and a missing person inquiry develops into a murder investigation. When Lomas says that the culprit would have escaped justice if the local police had handled the case, Reggie muses, in his customary languid way, "I wonder how many clever fellows do get away with it." Reggie Fortune was unique among great detectives to emerge after the First World War, in that he was seen to be best advantage in short stories rather than in novels. The stories were longer than the typical detective short story, and often explore intense human passions which seldom darken detective stories of the 20s written by Bailey's peers. In The Quiet Lady, Reggie discusses criminal motivation with an elderly doctor. Fellow thinks he's a very important fellow, ought to have more than he's got, ought to have his own way, so he takes it. Conceit, desire to show that a wonderful fellow he is. To prove his power over people's lives, some fellows will do anything for that. The telegraphic style of dialogue is charismatic, and so is the horrific behavior of the culprit. Reggie summarizes the case as not a nice business. When the old doctor accuses him of being rather terrible, if you're not sure, let's have mercy. Reggie's bleak response is, mercy, that's not my department. I work for justice. The little house sees Reggie dealing with one of the few cases that have frightened him, a seemingly innocuous, if puzzling, incident concerning a lost kitten introduces a grim tale about cruelty. The mistreatment of children is a subject that recurs in Bailey's work, as does the stinging criticism in Reggie's remark. I use only evidence, that's why I don't get on with lawyers and policemen. Henry Christopher Bailey began his literary career as an author of historical and romantic fiction, publishing his first novel shortly after leaving Oxford. He became a journalist, spending many years with the Daily Telegraph, where he was a colleague of E.C. Bentley. He turned to detective fiction after the First World War, perhaps partly influenced by Bentley's success, at much the same time as younger writers such as Christie and Sayers. But he lacked their interest in playing elaborate games with readers. Reggie Fortune, advisor to the Home Office, appeared in no fewer than 8 collections of stories before his first appearance in a novel, Shadow on the Wall. Agatha Christie was among his admirers. The stories stand or fall by Mr. Fortune. It is not the cases themselves, but Mr. Fortune's handling of them wherein lies the fascination. For Mr. Fortune is, undeniably, a great man. His method is the method of the knife, ruthless and incisive. Some of the best Fortune stories show the deduction of a whole malignant growth from one small, isolated incident. Bailey also created another long-running series character in the solicitor Joshua Klunk, whose path occasionally crosses that of Reggie Fortune. During the Golden Age itself, Bailey was one of the most highly regarded detective writers, but his reputation went into sharp decline after the Second World War. His mannered style of writing became deeply unfashionable and is likely to remain so. But today his concerns as a crime writer seem rather more modern than those of many of his contemporaries. The Poisoned Chocolates Case by Anthony Berkeley, 1929. Roger Sheringham was the most fallible of great detectives. Anthony Berkeley's desire to debunk the notion of the omniscient crime solver is made plain by the number of occasions when Roger, the Philip Trent in Trent's last case, came up with an ingenious solution to a baffling mystery, only to discover that his theory was hopelessly mistaken. As Roger reflects in The Jumping Jenny, 1933, also known as Dead Mrs. Stratton, that was the trouble with the old-fashioned detective story. One deduction only was drawn from each fact, and it was invariably the right deduction. The great detectives of the past certainly had luck. In real life, one can draw 100 plausible deductions from one fact, and they are all equally wrong. No detective novel offers a more concerning illustration of this principle than the Poisoned Chocolates case. The genesis of the plot can be found in a clever short story, The Avenging Chance, in which Roger solves the murder of Joan Beresford. Berkeley expanded the story, making changes in the process, above all by having Roger's solution shown to be mistaken. In an odd twist somehow typical of Berkeley's contrariness, the novel appears to have been published before the short story. Perhaps he realized that he had come up with a superb concept and felt it made commercial sense for the novel to appear first. Roger has founded the Crime Circle, a select dining club for people with a passion for criminology. There are just 5 other members: a famous lawyer, a leading woman dramatist, a prominent detective novelist, and the meek and modest Ambrose Chidderwick. Their guest, Roger's old sparring partner, Chief Inspector Moresby, is prevailed upon to recount the story of an apparently insoluble murder committed by the means of poisoned chocolates. Each of the 6 members, in turn, comes up with a proposed solution to the mystery, and all of them except Chidderwick cite actual cases in support of their theories, a reminder of Berkeley's acute interest in real-life crime. One after another, the superficially plausible explanations of the mystery are dismantled. To reinforce the point about the almost infinite possible interpretations of evidence, in 1979, Christiana Brand, a member of the Detection Club elected after the Second World War and a friend of Berkeley's, came up with a 7th solution to the puzzle of the poisoned chocolates. And in 2016, the present writer published an 8th. The American critic James Sando noted in the Dane Curse, also published in 1929, Dashiell Hammett solved that case no fewer than 4 times. This is almost certainly a coincidence, but Hammett reviewed at least one of Berkeley's novels and did find Roger Sheringham amusing. Unwise characters in detective novels continue to consume chocolates from questionable sources with predictably calamitous results. The device was used by such diverse and gifted writers as Agatha Christie in 3-Act Strategy, 1934, the American Helen McCloy in Who's Calling, 1942, and by Edmund Crispin in Buried for Pleasure as late as 1948. Sheringham's life bore a striking resemblance to his creators. Sheringham too was an Oxford graduate who fought and was wounded during the war, and then tried his hand at various jobs before making an unexpected success of writing a novel. He also shared Berkeley's fascination with criminology, which appealed not only to his sense of the dramatic, but to his feeling for the character. Berkeley modeled the get-togetherness of the Crimes Circle on the dinners he hosted at his home in Watford that led to his founding of the Detection Club, a prestigious organization for detective writers which elected its members by secret ballot and subjected them to an initiation ritual which entailed swearing an oath on a skull. Anthony Berkeley was a pseudonym of Anthony Berkeley Cox. After war service, Cox worked as a freelance journalist like his fellow Detection Club members A. Milne and Ronald Knox. He contributed humorous columns to Punch before turning to detective fiction. His ingenious and innovative plotting won immediate admiration, but he became increasingly interested in criminal psychology, which lay at the heart of the novels he wrote at Francis Ellis. The Mystery of a Butcher's Shop by Gladys Mitchell. Great detectives are distinctive characters, none more so than Mrs. Beatrice Adela Lestrange Bradley, described in this, her second appearance as a small, shriveled, bird-like woman who might have been 35 and who might have been 90, clad in a blue and sulphur jumper like the plumage of a macaw. She greets the Vicar of Wandles, Parva, with that air of easy condescension which is usually achieved by royalty only. Mrs. Bradley is the author of a small handbook of psychoanalysis and has moved to the stone house in Wandles, Parva, fresh from her exploits in Speedy Death, 1929, in which she not only solved the killing of a transvestite explorer, but took quite extraordinary measures in order to prevent another murder. Wandles, Parva boasts a manor house owned by a blackmailer, a wood which is the scene of all manner of nefarious activities, and a pagan stone circle complete with blood-splashed stone of sacrifice. After the blackmailer goes missing, human remains are found in the village butcher's shop, but neither decapitation nor dismemberment disturb the relentlessly playful tone of the narrative. Mrs. Bradley's idiosyncratic worldview is reflected in her comparison of a murderer with a doctor who is responsible for the birth of an illegitimate child. The population of this country is so excessive that looked at from the purely common sense point of view, a person who decreases it is considerably more public-spirited than one who adds to it, and he should be dealt with accordingly. Mitchell's ironic tone and ability to conjure up multiple solutions to a murder mystery are worthy of the work of Anthony Berkeley. In a satirical twist, the obvious suspect is neatly transformed into the least likely culprit before the final revelation. The ingenuity is reminiscent of Agatha Christie, but the flavor of Mitchell's writing is distinctive. To help draw together the threads of a complicated and coincidence-laden sequence of events, she supplies, in classic Golden Age fashion, not only entries from Mrs. Bradley's notebook, but also a timetable and two plans of the rural neighborhood. As in her debut novel, Mitchell was confident enough to confront convention head-on. Through Mrs. Bradley, she makes it plain that it is retrogressive to teach children that it is proper for factory owners to pay women about half what they would pay men are doing exactly the same work. For her, it's a frightfully progressive sign that so few intelligent people go to church, given that plutocrats invoke the will of heaven to make their workers put up with unacceptable conditions. Gladys Mitchell was a schoolteacher whose varied interests, including Freud and witchcraft, often found their way into her fiction. She also wrote mysteries at Malcolm Torrey and historical novels as Stephen Huckabee. Mrs. Bradley eventually appeared in no fewer than 66 novels, as well as numerous short stories, although their quality varied wildly. The best of them were amusingly original, just as improbable as many other plots was the casting of Diana Rigg as the star of the Mrs. Bradley Mysteries, a short-lived BBC TV series, first screened in 1998.